A few weeks ago, the March for Life took place in Washington, D.C. This annual event, which has been a yearly occurrence since 1974, was started by the Catholic lawyer and political activist Nellie Gray in response to the Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion 2 years before the March for Life began. Each year, pro-life supporters gather in Washington, D.C. and hold a series of rallies in which they express their disapproval of abortion and call for the reversal of Roe v. Wade. People normally turn out by the thousands for this event, with this year's event attracting an estimated 50,000 attendees. This recent event should bring our attention to the ongoing controversies surrounding abortion. For us as Catholics, we see abortion as being objectively a grave evil, one that results in the mutilation and death of some of the most innocent people among us. And yet the number of abortions occurring each year still numbers in the hundreds of thousands. The Guttmacher Institute found, for example, that in 2017 there were over 800,000 abortions in the United States, which is the same as 13.5 abortions for every 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 44. Abortion is, needless to say, one of the most controversial of all of the hot-button issues in bioethics today. In light of this, I hope to make a video series that focuses on the arguments for and against abortion, ultimately arguing in favor of a Catholic perspective. I would like to ease my way into this series by first talking about what could be considered the low-hanging fruit of this debate. Back a while ago, actor James Franco and Eliot Michaelson, a professor of philosophy at King's College in London, began a YouTube channel titled Philosophy Time. One of their videos has garnered more attention than any of the others, in which they interview the Princeton-based professor of philosophy Elizabeth Harman on the topic of abortion. This video has gained more attention than any of the others. For example, since the channel started in 2016, they've posted only 4 videos, with 3 out of the 4 getting views only in the tens of thousands. But this video has received almost 800,000 views since the time of its original publication. So let's look at the part of the video where Dr. Harman really gets to the crux of her argument.
So a lot of people think, well, it's permissible to have an abortion, but something bad happens when the fetus dies. And I think if a fetus hasn't ever been conscious, it hasn't ever had any experiences, and we abort it at that stage, that actually nothing morally bad happens. And this view might seem unattractive because it might seem that it dictates a cold attitude towards all early fetuses. But what I think is that actually among early fetuses, there are 2 very different kinds of beings. So, James, when you were an early fetus, and Eliot, when you were an early fetus, all of us, I think that we already did have moral status then. But we had moral status in virtue of our futures, in virtue of the fact that we were the beginning stages of persons. But some early fetuses will die early in pregnancy, either due to abortion or miscarriage. And in my view, that's a very different kind of entity. That's something that doesn't have a future as a person, and it doesn't have moral status.
So, the argument is this. First, she states that the worth of a being is based on whether or not it has moral status. Moral status is determined by whether or not a thing is conscious and therefore has had or is capable of having experiences. Now, just because a fetus lacks consciousness does not mean that it lacks moral value. She claims that moral value is something, to use a phrase she employs later on in the video, quote-unquote, endowed to the fetus by virtue of its future.
Another thing that you were bringing up was the idea that on my view, in aborting, we're taking away the moral status. That the fetus would have had moral status, but then by aborting, we take it away. And I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think the right way to look at it is that just given the current state of the fetus, it's not having any experiences, there's nothing about its current state that would make it a member of the moral community. It's derivative of its future that it gets to have moral status. So it's really that the future endows moral status on it. And if we allow it to have this future, then we're allowing it to be the kind of thing that now would have moral status.
So even though the fetus, based on everything Dr. Harman said, doesn't seem like the sort of being that would have moral value, if it survives pregnancy, then it does have moral status by virtue of the fact that it will eventually become a person. She even admits as much in the argument herself, where she states that a fetus represents the first stage of a person. Yet, if a child were not to survive pregnancy, then it lacks moral value. So in a word, her argument is 1. A creature has worth if it has moral status. 2. A fetus that does not survive pregnancy does not have moral status. 3. Therefore, a fetus that does not survive pregnancy does not have the same worth or dignity as a full-on person. Because this is the case, you are not undermining its dignity, since it had no dignity to begin with. There are a few problems with this argument, yet the one that I would like to focus in on is the one that everyone focuses in on. Later on in the video, she says, quote, "Some early fetuses will die early in pregnancy, either due to abortion or miscarriage," unquote. So let's think about this carefully. A fetus lacks moral value if it dies before birth. A being, in this case a fetus, who either at that time lacks any conscious experience or will never have it in the future, has no moral value. It is therefore permissible to get an abortion. Yet one of the things that could cause a fetus to have no future is abortion. So, you choose to get an abortion, which causes the child to never get to the point to where it develops the capacity for conscious experience, which means it has no value, which means it's okay to abort it. Yet, one of the things that causes a fetus to not have moral value is the fact that you chose to abort it. Thus, one of the preconditions for abortion being morally permissible is that at some point in the future you choose to abort the fetus that you are currently carrying. Essentially, it almost sounds as if she is saying, abortion is a morally self-validating position. Abortion is okay just because you choose to get an abortion. Yet, she addresses this exact point later on, going on to say,
if a woman decides to have an abortion with an early fetus, just that act or that intention negates the moral status of that early fetus. Just because if she goes out and has an abortion, she's pretty certain that it's not going to become a person.
Right. So it might look like, on my view, abortion is permissible because you had the abortion.
Yeah.
But that abortion wouldn't have been permissible if you didn't have the abortion.
Right.
Well, that's not quite
Okay.
That's not quite the view for, I think, two different reasons.
Okay.
So one reason is that you have moral status, and in my view, back when you were an early fetus, you had moral status. But it's not that aborting you would have been wrong, because if your mother had chosen to abort her pregnancy, then it wouldn't have been the case that you would have had moral status, because you would have died as an early fetus. So she would have been aborting something that didn't have moral status. So my view isn't that if you do abort, abortion is okay, but if you don't abort, abortion would have been wrong. But what it turns out is that it's a contingent matter that you have moral status. You actually have moral status, but you might not have counted morally at all. If you had been aborted, you would have existed, but you just would have had this really very short existence in which you wouldn't have mattered morally.
What? Now, I really do want to steelman this position. I mean, I do. I really, really do. But I just can't. It's not even that this argument is a bad argument in the sense of being logically invalid, but the way in which she argues it is absolutely terrible. It seems as if her larger point is that whether or not a fetus has moral value, and therefore whether or not it is permissible to abort it, is based on whether or not it has a future where it has moral value. The moral value of a fetus is essentially a contingent matter. Yet she goes on to say that if your parents had chosen to abort you, you wouldn't have had a future as a morally significant being, and therefore the abortion would have been justified. Again, it still sounds as if she's saying that abortion is permissible because you chose to get an abortion. To conclude, I think the main thing we can learn from this video is that regardless of where you fall on this debate, this is just an absolutely terrible argument. And this isn't even a gotcha moment. There are other pro-choice arguments which are significantly stronger than this one. So I guess it's simply a matter of me giving advice to the pro-choice movement. Please do not use this argument. And if you do use this argument, make sure it's argued in a much more logically valid manner.